All right, we should be live. Cool. So we'll just kind of give our audience a couple minutes to, or a little bit, not necessarily a couple minutes, but a little bit to trickle in. Since we don't have any viewers yet, but at some point we're just going to kind of hit go here. So. All right, try this. Trying to make this work here. Okay. Hello, Kamazotz is with us.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. So, no time like the present to get started. So, welcome one and all to part 7 of our ongoing discussion of the German Revolution by Pierre Broué. Last time we discussed chapters 19 through 22, and this time we're going to be talking chapters 23 through 26. Two of my usual co-hosts are gone for today. Kyle and Izzy are both gone, but I'm joined by one and hopefully shortly a second special guest. So I'm gonna go ahead and start us off with introductions here. I'm gonna switch over to these screens here. So for introductions, we're just gonna kind of go around and go name, pronouns, and your YouTube channel or your blog or whatever it is you want people to know about, and just a short description of why you think it's important for modern leftists to study the German Revolution. I can start things off. I'm Melody. I use she, her pronouns, and this is my YouTube channel called A World to Win, where I talk about history and political theory from a Marxist perspective. And yeah, I'm going to hand things off to my guests or my co-hosts so they can introduce themselves. Take it away, folks.
I'm Simba. You can find me on Twitter at Yo It's Simba. I also have a YouTube channel where mostly I deal with Black and Indigenous issues and labor history here in North America. But the German Revolution is really important to focus on, especially because it wasn't just a failed communist revolution. It was also a failure of liberal democracy, which I'm sure that all of us here in America can relate to. So that's me.
All right. Elizabeth, you can go ahead and introduce yourself.
All right, so my name is Elizabeth. Melody asked me to co-host for this week since a couple of people were missing. She, her pronouns, and I think that studying the German Revolution is important, partly because, I think looking at any revolution in sort of detail helps us sort of move beyond generalities and look at sort of the concrete tactics and strategies that happen on the ground, and also particularly for socialists in the United States, looking at a revolution targeted against sort of a older, more powerful capitalist government and how that affects the dynamics of revolution.
All right. Yeah, thank you. Still trying to get a hold of our friend Kiara here. So I haven't heard back from her yet. But so just to kind of familiarize folks who are maybe joining us for the first time of how we run things here, we typically spend, depending on the length of our reading selection, which is we always do 4 chapters at a time because usually there's 4 of us co-hosting here. So we usually spend about the first hour or so of the stream discussing or summarizing the chapters that we read. And then we spend the remaining hour just kind of having a free-form discussion about either things that we found confusing or, things that, like terminology we're not familiar with, that kind of thing, right? Because this is not, and if you're coming back, you'll hear me repeat this a lot, but we're not a panel of experts. We're curious people reading a difficult book and having a public study group so that folks can tune in and learn and feel free, feel okay to acknowledge that studying history is not easy. It's but it's nonetheless it's quite essential. So without further ado, we're going to get into our summaries here, starting with chapter 23, and I'm still trying to get a hold of Kiara, and she was supposed to do our first summary. So hopefully I'll be able to get her on the line soon, but looks like she's not responding so far.
Is she on?
Is she on what?
I was
Sorry.
just gonna ask, is she on Twitter or?
Yeah, I sent her. I DM'd her on Twitter.
Okay,
so
great.
not. Yeah. But show must go on. So I suppose. Let me pull up the book here in my window so that I can start doing her summary while we wait for her. So last time we wrapped up talking a bit about Paul Levy with chapter 22. That was the end of the last selection. And here we go. Here's chapter 23. So, I'm just gonna start kind of reading a little bit from it, and I'll be skipping through as appropriate. So, chapter 23 is called "The First Steps of the Unified Communist Party." The year 1920 saw both the end of the Civil War in Russia and the formation in Germany of a mass communist party. But in 1921 was, for world communism, the year of the Kronstadt uprising and the first serious internal crisis of the Soviet Republic to turn from war communism to the new economic policy, NEP. After the conclusion of the Civil War in autumn, the Russian communists were plunged into discussions, including the debate about the trade unions, which expressed the confusion of people who saw decomposing before their eyes the country which for 2 years had been the battlefield of ferocious conflict. Their eyes were fixed on their own problems, and they were not to understand immediately that the international situation had also changed. The time had passed of the convulsive attacks by workers rendered desperate by suffering, and who felt power to be within their reach. Communists in every country had to admit that capitalism had stabilized itself, survived a post-war revolutionary crisis, and discovered new resources and new capacity to endure. The communists' awareness of these new conditions and their willingness to accept them emerged in a piecemeal way and involved a series of passionate arguments. The resistance to the reality which dissipated with what Bukharin called the illusions of childhood took on tragically puerile forms. Communists, rank and file, and leaders alike, tried to compel the workers to fight. In their impatience, they rejected the methods that no longer seemed to function, and acted as if incantations and imprecations could produce miracles, as if it were enough to desire the revolution for it to happen. I had to look up this word, imprecation. It means like a curse. I didn't know what that meant. It's a cool word. I like that word. So, moving on. I'm going to be doing broad strokes here. I'm not going to be reading the whole chapter, or we will be here all day. I'm going to go ahead and try to give Kiara another call. Nope. It's all right. Let's keep moving. All right. So the expectation was very much in from the Soviets that basically that the many of the European countries were in a revolutionary situation, and that basically that was the job of communists to basically liberate the struggling masses. And there's some problems with that, which is that, for example, they expected in 1920 a quick victory in Poland, where they fully expected that the communists there would, be victorious, and that the peasants and workers there would side with the communists, and revolution would spread, just like domino effect. That's not what happened. The March on Warsaw did not go very well, and the Polish peasantry and proletariat largely sided with their national groups against the Reds. So here's a good piece here. The summer offensive against Poland, led by Tukhachevsky's Red Army, had only been an illusion. For most communists, his lightning counterattack had sounded both the death knell of capitalism in Europe and the call to insurrection. In a reverberating article called A Policy of Revolutionary Offensive, Bukharin argued that the Bolsheviks could and should export the revolution on the points of bayonets. A provisional government of veteran Polish communists was waiting, ready to place itself at the head of Polish workers, who were expected to rise up when their liberators arrived. That did not go as they had planned at all. So let's skip ahead a little bit more here. The negative balance sheet of 1920 was soon to be revealed. Like those like Trotsky, Radek, and some of the Polish communists who had opposed the March on Warsaw had doubted the possibilities of the military export of revolution had been correct, and Lenin had erred. Not only had the Polish workers and poor peasants not risen, but they fought beside their generals and their grandees, along with the advisors from the Entente, for their independence against the Red Army. The victorious advance of the Red Army had given way to a headlong retreat, which led to an armistice. So basically, the revolutionary wave which was sweeping Europe was starting to ebb by the time that this stuff all happens. Like the biggest pieces of the biggest kind of flashpoints in the post-war revolutionary activity had kind of already hit their high watermark and were at this point in a bit of a state of retreat. Lenin noted that the tempo of development of the revolution in capitalist countries was far slower than it had been in Russia, but Zinoviev was telling the Italian socialists that the proletarian revolution was imminent. Perhaps he was convinced that a revolutionary victory on the part of the parties of the International would ensure that Russia could avoid having to initiate the NEP, which he had accepted only reluctantly after having vigorously opposed it in the Russian Political Bureau. Let us try giving Kiara another call here. Oh well. Bear with me, folks. I was not planning on having to summarize this chapter, so I'm working hard to kind of. I'm working hard to kind of pick out the really important bits that I think get across the overall tenor of what's going on in this chapter. And Simba and Elizabeth, you're welcome to help me out here because I'm I'm struggling a little bit. So, here this is my favorite bit here that I was talking with my co-hosts a little bit before we went live about what I thought was a funny thing said about Paul Levy by Karl Radek. There was a sharp incident at the party congress before the unification. Radek accused Levy of wanting to do nothing but educate communists until the party was had white hairs on its super intelligent head. That was a zesty barb that I thought was stood out to me. Okay, so the other thing that goes on in this chapter is that the KAPD, which is the Communist Workers' Party, is admitted to the Communist International on kind of a provisional basis, kind of under the assumption by the executive committee that it's basically either the KAPD or the KPD, one or the other, is basically going to become the one true Communist Party of Germany. Yeah, that's get the important bits here. Yeah, here's probably, I think, the most important passage from this part, which is, the ultra-leftists in general, and Gorder in particular, confuse the minority of the proletariat, the labor aristocracy and bureaucracy, particularly the trade unions, with the millions trapped in the apparatuses who, they claimed, were bourgeoisified, but whom, in reality, they refused to emancipate. The communists had to learn how to break the crust if the Western working class was really bourgeoisified, that would mean the end of the hopes of the revolutionaries. Gorter, like Pannekerk, was following the intellectual course of Bernstein. They scrutinized the situation with the advanced countries without taking the world situation into account. To have declared, as he did, that the British proletariat was isolated was to neglect the fact that the world revolution had a dual character of proletarian revolution in the West and agrarian and national revolution in the East. The success of a revolution in a single country was no longer conceivable over a long period, and it was world revolution that was being discussed. Trotsky ended by declaring once again, in opposition to Gorder, that the Bolshevik experience of the mass party had to be completely assimilated into in the world communist movement on the basis of a global analysis. So the end result here is that the executive committee votes overwhelmingly in favor of the provisional admission of the KAPD as a sympathizing party with a consultative vote into the International. So the International is the Communist Internationals, the body of basically like a congress of communist parties established after the Bolshevik Revolution to kind of consolidate the victories of the Bolshevik Revolution and spread revolution across Europe and hopefully the rest of the world. It was the third international was formed after the second international had kind of failed during the beginning of World War I, where the parties, the socialist parties of the Second International had voted to side with their respective ruling classes in pushing for the war effort. And let's see, let's try to pick out a couple more key points of this chapter. Here is this key excerpt from an article that Paul Levy writes about why it's basically not good to have both the KAPD and the KPD in the Comintern, which is as follows. The situation in which the ECCI, the Executive Committee of the Communist International, has created is not tolerable for either of us, or for the KAPD, and for the Communist International. It is a disaster of the greatest magnitude. We are for rigorous international discipline, and for the executive to have all the powers which the Constitution of the Communist International confers upon it. But none of the provisions of the Constitution of the Communist International compels us to recognize as a stroke of genius every decision of the ECCI, as we say openly. The decision of the executive concerning the KAPD is not a stroke of genius, but very much the opposite. Radek replied tartly with a treacherous allusion to the old social democratic version, deeply rooted against the working people who are not quite clearly revolutionary. How much further we can get here. So there's open letter. Trying to pick out what's really important here. Supposed to just move on, maybe.
Great. So should I go on to chapter 24?
Yeah, I think it's probably. I'm sorry, folks. I tried to kind of improvise a summary of chapter 23, which I was not expecting to have to do. So I think I'm just going to pass things over to Elizabeth, who has graciously said that she will summarize chapter 24. So apologies for the slightly improvised summary there, but I think it's time to just keep moving. The show must go on. So yeah, take it away, Elizabeth.
Okay, so the next chapter, chapter 24, is called The Split in the Italian Socialist Party. So we're taking a step sort of outside Germany to both the effects of the revolution in Germany on the Italian Socialist Party and how the crisis in the Italian Socialist Party then reflected back onto the German Communist Party. So basically, the Italian Socialist Party was the first mass party to join the Comintern, so the first party with any real sort of numbers or heft in the working class besides like the Bolsheviks themselves, and joined in 1919 before the adoption of the 21 conditions, which you all have talked about before. But so because of this, well, first you can just tell by the name, right? So they're called the Italian Socialist Party, not the Italian Communist Party, which is sort of a silly point of semantics, but was actually a point of like debate in the Comintern at this time. So the two major things are, one, the factory occupations that occurred in Italy in around 1920. So it's called like the 2 Red Years, where there were major occupations of important factories in Italy by the working class, which ultimately did not proceed into sort of a revolutionary upsurge or revolutionary movement, and was eventually sort of able to be like diverted by Giolitti, the Italian leader at the time. So this caused a huge amount of dissension within the party, and specifically around the figure of Turati, who is basically the reformist wing, led the reformist wing of the Italian Socialist Party. So you have Turati, you have the sort of left of the party, which is Gramsci, Bordiga, and Bombaci, who's the less famous of those, I guess. And then in between them, sort of trying to split the difference, you have Sforati, who Broué terms sort of a left centrist. So he basically trying to keep both the left and the right of the party together in order to try and preserve the mass character of the Italian Socialist Party during this major crisis it's going through. Whereas the left wants to make a decisive break with the reformists and sees this as necessary to, become a truly communist party. So basically, this leads to a split at the Livorno Congress. So a majority of people vote for Serrati's position, where he says, we'll accept the 21 conditions, but apply them to our own situation the way we see fit, which is, really kind of doesn't mean anything in my opinion. But you have a minority that wants to go sort of full bore clean split with Turati and with the right wing. So they that faction breaks away, which is a minority of the party, and forms what will become the Italian Communist Party, which is the successor, which is the original party of what becomes the PCI. So Levi, looking at it from sort of his analysis of the German Revolution, sees this as another example of the executive committee of the Comintern sort of forcing unnecessary splits and aggressive action onto its member parties, and characterizes it in this way. Karl responds and basically says that Levi is wrong, and this has basically the reason why this becomes tangled up in the German question is it ties into the whole sort of overall world perspectives of, what stage are we at in sort of this revolutionary upsurge, followed by a counteroffensive by the bourgeoisie, the question of the relationship between the Bolsheviks, who are necessarily the most powerful party in the Comintern, and the member parties, etc. So Levy says, it's fine to split with Tarati, but basically it shouldn't have been done this way, and we unnecessarily cut ourselves off from a lot of like working class people who are like, good working class militants in the PSI. And argues against sort of the theory of the offensive that's being put forth by certain people within the Comintern, including Rakoczy and Kabakchev. And in this book, as in like a lot of sort of accounts, the Hungarian emigre communists get a really bad rap as sort of just like hovering around the Comintern and, after having the Hungarian Revolution having collapsed and sort of forcing misguided policies, or I guess ultra-left policies. I guess my main issue with this like chapter and with the book more generally is sort of the lack of like social history and like rank and file analysis going along with sort of the like higher level like Comintern debates, which I think are very important, but it makes it hard to evaluate when you're looking at like, if you're looking at like the debate over the PSI, like it would be nice to have some more like concrete analysis of like what happened during the factory occupations, like what did the PSI do, what were their mistakes, which workers stayed with the PSI, which went to the PCI, like why, that sort of thing. Yeah, and I also advise if people enjoy this book or like want to look more, looking at John Riddell's collections on the Comintern. So he basically collected and translated, along with others, basically the first 4 congresses of the Comintern. So there's like a complete transcript. So it's like a good source, I think, in looking, if you're interested in the conversations, and how exactly they sort of played out. And you also see sort of very, like I went through and looked at it, and I said to the other host before this, I have read this book, but it's been a while, and so it was kind of difficult to just jump back in and have all of the, ECCI, like very personal and specific factualism. But yeah. So but anyway, sorry, I would advise looking that book up if you're interested in looking at like sort of the full speeches and debates between on these and other issues.
Yeah, sorry, is that sorry, I tuned out a little bit for a sec. Was that the communist movement at a crossroads? Is that the one you just recommended?
I'm looking at To the Masses, which is the one from the Third Congress. So that's the one that we're on now with like the debate about the March Action and the Livorno Congress and all that.
Yeah, so there's a related book which I also want to recommend to folks called The Communist Movement at Crossroads, plenums of the Communist International's Executive Committee from 1922 to 1923, which is actually not as boring as it sounds. Has a lot to do with questions about how to fight fascism, and it is edited by Mike Tabor and John Rydell. Hey, Kiara's here.
Oh, hey.
Hey, so we actually just wrapped up summarizing chapter 24. I did a little tap dance trying to improvise a summary of chapter 23, but if you have one, we would love to hear it. But otherwise, why don't you introduce yourself, just name, pronouns, and why you think it's important for people to the modern left to study the German Revolution, and maybe like where folks can find you on Twitch and or any blog or Twitter or whatever social media you want folks to find you on. I can't hear you.
I think you're muted.
Yeah, you're muted. Huh. Doesn't say you're muted here, so it must be on your end.
Better now?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Awesome. Hey. Okay, let's start with the... Hi, my name is Kiara Husk. You will find me on Twitch/Kiara Husk, where I do leftist content. I am also the most middle-aged interior policy advisor in the world. And yeah, I do leftist content. I talk a lot about history. I talk a lot about economy. I talk a lot about anarchism, because yes, I'm an anarchist. I guess that's it.
Okay.
And, oh yeah, why the German Revolution is important? Well, I think actually the German Revolution or the Weimar Republic is one of my favorite topics in history as of today, and I think that there is no better or more significant event in history, especially as we look at the events that unfold today and now in the 2020s. That we can learn from, because there's a lot of similarities, not exactly always the same, but there's a lot of similarities, and I would say that it's one of the revolution that was very, very deeply rooted and started within a working class movement or within the working class. Yeah.
All right. And so would you be ready to give us your chapter 23 summary, or do you need a minute to get yourself together, or?
Okay, this was like a really hard transition for me right now, because I was just in a debate to the death, and now I'm here.
It's all right.
Let me try to get it. Okay, so the chapter was, as far as I can recall, talking about the opposition between the KPD and the KAPD, which were the Kommunistische Arbeiterpartei Deutschlands, I think, which was the KAPD compared to the Kommunistische Partei Deutschlands. And it was talking about the back and forth between Levi, the basically leader or de facto leader of the KPD in Germany, and I forgot the name of the Polish communist. What was his name? Sorry.
Radek?
Yeah, Radek.
Karl Radek.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It was basically talking about the power struggle that was going on between Radek and Levi, and the difference between Radek and Levi that they had on the views of how to bring forth the revolution and how to free not only just the Polish workers but also the German workers, in terms of especially talking about the support of the unions and how the unions could be taking part in the revolutionist movement, where Radek said that that they can mostly be used, as I can recall it, and to further the cause. And Levi was the opinion that they were more of a bourgeois movement that was opposed to any revolution. And so it was discussed in the ECCI that to have an intervention, for example, in Poland, and to basically march into Poland and hope for a workers' uprising, which sadly never happened. But yeah, Radek said that they could be motivated to do so, and was also involved heavily in the union movements in Stuttgart, for example, that was going on in Germany at the time. Whereas Levi opposed that and spoke out about that. And there was a lot of exchange of different open letters that judged the ability of a revolutionary movement or a revolutionary will from different kinds of organizations. For example, workers' unions in Germany.
All right. Thank you. Next, so we just skipped back to chapter 23. Welcome, everybody, by the way, who's just joining us now. We've got 10 people watching us live. That's wonderful. Simba is now going to talk about chapter 25. Are you ready to do that, comrade?
Yes. However, my notes are like not entirely complete. So at the later end, if I could ask for some help, that'd be awesome.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, dope. Regardless, so eventually after all of this, and because Karl Radek, the Polish communist who was mentioned earlier, was really critical of Paul Levi, he resigned as chairman and was promptly expelled for being a kind of a do-nothing dude and having a petite bourgeois inclination about things. Radek was especially critical of Levi, well, of everybody, like I said before, for sitting on his hands and being kind of useless. Radek wanted to focus on the VKPD becoming more active and blamed the so-called conciliatory attitude of Brandler, Stocketer, and Tollimer. And he ranted against the possibility of a split in their party, rather, he wanted to remove the inactive elements in leadership and keep the active left-wing elements like Damig and Zetkin. After all of that, Broué kind of goes into a mini biography of Bela Kun during the March action. And a lot of important information surrounding Bela Kun is kind of foggy, but we do know that the Hungarian revolutionary, Bela Kun, got to Berlin around the end of February or maybe the beginning of March. And he was a social democratic politician in Hungary who became a huge fan of Bolshevism in 1917 when he was a prisoner of war. He snuck into Hungary and founded the Hungarian Communist Party. Hungary had its own revolution that wasn't super successful. And he actually fled to Moscow a bit after that, and he was blamed for having prisoners allegedly from the White Army executed, as Broué writes, contrary to the pledge given to them. And Lenin criticized him for that, as well as for making opportunist errors during the failed communist revolution in Hungary. And Broué says that the reason Bela Kun was entrusted to take on a mission to Germany might kind of be buried in the archives. At the time that he wrote, I think this book came out sometime in the 1970s. Is that right?
Yeah, like 75? Elizabeth,
Yeah.
do you know? That's all right.
If I remember correctly, it was like 75, 76.
Okay.
So at this time, I
just checked. So the edition I have is actually from 1998.
Mm-hmm.
Is that the Haymarket print or the Brill print?
The Haymarket one.
Cool.
Okay.
Yeah, it was originally published in 1971.
Gotcha. And then
okay.
The edition, the Haymarket version, which is what I'm reading, he writes that not all of the information is there. Maybe it's buried in the archives, something like that. So he doesn't he proposes a couple of theories about ideas of what the reason he went to Berlin could be, but some of them one of them in particular is just clearly wrong, which was that people were saying that Bela Kun went there to distract or to do something with the Kronstadt revolution, but that happened after he left, so that couldn't have been a reason that had to do with it. It's more likely, Broué says, that Bela Kun went to Berlin on his own initiative. And Bela Kun kind of convened with German communist leaders to talk about the revolutionary offensive, which was a trendy idea in Moscow at the time, which is a really aggressive attitude towards intervening actively during international crises of capitalism. And if necessary, this taught the German communist leaders to force the development of revolution by appealing to the temporarily inactive working class. Force the Development of Revolution is also the name of that part of the book in that chapter. And there was a whole lot of debate about this, which then led to the March action, if I remember correctly. And from there, my notes kind of like aren't quite as clear. So does anybody want to pick up where I left off, or want to correct me on anything?
Let me pull up chapter 25 here.
If not, that's cool. I'll just move on.
Yeah. Why don't you make what you can of your notes, and I'll be here with my with my PDF trying to catch up.
Okay. All right. So, actually, Kiara, you were saying something about the debates during the March action, right? Yeah, Kiara?
Yeah.
Yeah. You were saying something about the debates during about the March action, right?
Yeah, a bit.
Earlier? Yeah, so that part was kind of confusing to me. Do you want to say anything about that, maybe? Because that's about where I left off.
That was in chapter 23?
Chapter
25.
Okay. Okay, let me see what I can recall. No, I'm blanking. Sorry.
That's all right.
It's okay. So
we've got the book. We've got the book. It's all right.
Okay, fair enough.
When in doubt, we've got a very high quality book that we can simply read from. Okay.
All right. So in the PDF, this would be 524. In the book, it would be 495.
495.
Kind of.
Cool.
Yeah.
So there we are.
Yeah. During the debates, the Central Committee voted to abandon its opposition on principle to partial strikes, and further decided to develop and widen the agricultural workers' struggles for higher wages. It considered that a partial victory in one sector, however exceptional, would restore confidence to the masses and awaken their offensive spirit. The politicization of the strike movement would be effective under slogans such as "Down with the Fehrenbach government," alliance with Soviet Russia, which would make unity possible. I think that kind of characterizes the end of the debates about the March action. Right there. Which is that they kind of like took what I would call a centrist position on being active with inactive workers. And kind of more aggressive, especially since Paul Levi was gone as the de facto kind of leader of the KPD.
Yeah. So, let's get into that a bit then. So you pick up here on page, let's see, it's 498 in the paper book and page 527 in the PDF. Everything changed during the course of that day. First, Eberlein arrived in Halle and explained that to the local leaders that they must at all costs provoke an uprising in central Germany, which would be the first stage of the revolution. No means could be ruled out for shaking the workers out of their passivity, and he went so far as to suggest organizing faked attacks on the VKPD or other workers' organizations, or kidnapping known leaders in order to blame the police and their reactionaries, and in this way provoke the anger of the masses. None of these projects was to be carried out after the failure of an attempt to blow up the munitions factory in Szczecin? Oh, sorry, I don't know German very well at all. Things changed when Max Holtz arrived in Halle on the evening of the 21st of March. A hero of the armed struggles of March 1920 against cops supporters had been expelled from the BKPD for adventurism, and after falling out with Brandler and having lived clandestinely, occasionally taking part in the expropriations carried out by such leaders of armed gangs such as Karl Pleitner, to finance the KAPD and its activities, illegal and otherwise. And trying to here pick out a little bit more. Okay, here's another kind of a flashpoint here. So on the 30th of March, Pravda, which is the official publication of the Bolsheviks in Germany, in Russia, under the headline "The German Revolution," hailed the German workers who were on the attack. It said, with the slogan of an alliance with Soviet Russia, and under the leader of the communists to aid the Soviet Republic. It welcomed the combination of strikes with armed uprisings, which constituted the highest form of struggle known to the proletariat, and expressed delight that for the first time the German proletariat has risen with a communist party of 500,000 members at the head of the struggle. A few days later, Steklov in Izvestia, which is another Bolshevik publication, was already raising the question whether the German communists did not bear responsibility for a serious defeat by launching prematurely into a bid for power. The action had ended, but the discussion was just beginning, and that's the end of chapter 25 here. Simba, do you want to follow up on that at all?
Yeah, I mean, the whole rest of it is a whole bunch of armed conflicts, some which were successful and to some extent helpful, and some which were not so much, and some which were like just very like adventurous. And that last paragraph just summarizes it really well. I mean, on the whole, it was something that the workers of Germany could unite with Soviet Russia at the time about.
Yeah, and it seems like, I think, kind of the ongoing theme from our previous chapters that we read 2 weeks ago is that basically Moscow has kind of a distorted view of what's going on in a lot of these situations, partially due to just lack of good information. Anyhow, it seems like, nonetheless, like there was definitely on the part of the German communists like a pretty severe miscalculation on the mood of the masses and what was what was and wasn't a good idea in terms of like, is this a good time for insurrection? Well, it seems like we're in the right time and place, so ready, steady, go. But it was kind of a giant shit show, as kind of a lot of the things leading up to this had also been.
Facts.
Sorry, what?
That's just a fact, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, what we've read so far in this live stream, we've read roughly now the first half of this book, and if all else fails, you can end a sentence with, and then a giant shit show ensued, and you could be talking about literally any part of this book. So let us now move on to chapter 26, which, again, Izzy was going to be summarizing, but she couldn't join us, so I'm going to be kind of improvising this one as well. I've had a little bit more time to prepare with it, though, so but just bear with me. I'm doing my damnedest. So the days which followed the defeat of the march. Sorry, this is on page 505 of the real book. If you want to follow along. The days which followed the defeat of the March action revealed the extent of the disaster which the VKPD's leaders had inflicted upon their party. They had not been able to lead all their own members into action. Some members of the party publicly denounced the strike. Many left the party, sometimes noisily, sometimes quickly slipping away. Within a few weeks, the party had lost some 200,000 members. Let's see, let's keep moving on. Brandler, the chairman of the party, was sentenced to 5 years of hard labor and imprisonment for high treason. So a lot of the kind of top brass of the KPD are being arrested as a result of the March action. Tens of thousands of strikers lose their jobs and are blacklisted by employers. At this point, this is on page 506. It is not clear whether the responsibility where the responsibility for the disaster lay. Many activists knew that on the 17th of March, the Central Committee had decided only on a possible response to Horsing's offensive in the Mansfeld region. Well into the 1960s, East German historians adhered almost entirely to the interpretation that viewed the March action purely as a defensive reaction by working people in central Germany to a provocation on the part of the authorities. This was indeed the first version to be put about, at least when the defeat became evident. On the 7th of April, Friesland stated at a meeting of leading activists in Berlin that the party had been obliged to respond to this offensive, but that conflicts had broken out in central Germany against the intention and even the instructions of the Zentrale, the Central Committee of the KPD. And let's see, it's Friesland says of the kind of where the responsibility lies here. He says, I say that the blame lies in the failure of the working masses who did not understand the situation and did not give reply that they should have given, which seems like just absolute like projection to me. Like, no, you. But Paul Levy did not see things as Friesland had put it. During the vital days of March, he was not in Germany. Immediately before the action, he had an angry discussion with Bela Kuhn, and then left for Italy, having, as he said, been assured that nothing important could happen before Easter. Oh, hey, it's Easter. In Vienna, he learned of the March action and was thus able to appreciate the magnitude of the catastrophic turn which had taken after he and his comrades had resigned from the Zentrale. Clara Zetkin, was able to describe his initial reaction to Lenin and Trotsky. Quote, the unfortunate March action shook him to the depths. He firmly believed that the very existence of the party was frivolously laid at stake, and everything for which Rosa, Karl, Leo, and so many others gave their lives squandered away. He cried, literally cried with pain at the thought that the party was lost. He thought that it could only be saved by using the sharpest methods. End quote. Oh, hey, Queer POTUS is with us. Thank you for coming. Oh, he has to go. That's too bad. But thanks for stopping by. It's always nice to have you here. Now I'm gonna skip ahead a little bit just to get a better. Yeah, so the reaction from the common turn is not is rather severe. So it on the 4th of April, it issued a statement regarding the resignation from the Central Committee of Levy, Zetkin, Damig, and others. It characterized this as desertion. By the way, this is on page 515 in the real book. It characterized this as desertion and declared the reason why Comrade Levy and his group left the Zentrala of the German Communist Party was not the Italian question, but opportunist vacillations in respect of the policies for Germany and on the international level. The executive committee went on to express the hope that Levy's conduct would open the eyes of the comrades who had sided with him. On the 6th of April, for the first time, the leading committee adopted a position on the March action, which it hailed as the first organized attack by the German proletariat since March 1919, and ascribed its defeat to the inconceivable treachery of the Social Democratic Party and to the refusal of the independents to plunge into struggle at the side of the communists. The German communists the executive committee solemnly declared, "The Communist International says to you, you acted rightly. The working class can never win victory by a single blow. You have turned a new page in the history of the German working class. Prepare for new struggles." So as you can see, there's like a certain level of just kind of cluelessness on both the part of Moscow and from the party itself. They're both making some pretty severe political miscalculations that are costing them dearly in terms of both kind of repression and their inability to really effectively connect with the masses, despite the fact that the party had grown to nearly 500,000 people. And I'm going through here. Oh, I think that probably the best choice at this point is to simply move on, because I don't have a very well prepared summary here, and I think just reading from the chapter is not going to get us anywhere. So I think we should just kind of move on to our discussion period. So if folks are ready for that, we just kind of do a free-form discussion. There's no, it's just kind of thing where we cover like questions that came up during the reading, or what we think this has implications for how the left today goes about its business. But yeah, I'm going to open it up to my co-hosts and of course to chat. If you've been following along, if you've been listening with us, definitely welcome you to ask your questions or make comments, and we'll try to incorporate your feedback into the discussion. We try to orient these streams so that they're as accessible as possible to people listening and people who are hopefully reading along in the book with us. I am going to switch over here real quick to make a quick plug for the channel itself. If you like our show, if you like hearing us come on and talk about these important issues, summarizing these books and that sort of thing, please consider supporting the channel directly through my Patreon, which is up on the screen now. And if you can't do that, that's okay. Money's tight right now. So if you like the show and you want to see more of it, please follow me on Twitter and retweet my posts about these streams so that they can get more eyeballs on them. So with that, I'm going to pass things back over to my co-host so that we can keep talking. Were there any kind of things that stood out to you folks about this reading selection that either things that were kind of striking events or that sort of thing?
I have a question for you guys. Do you think, in general, like German communist and Russian communist relations were better before or after Levi was removed? Like, just in general.
I would say that, I mean, they were never that good to begin with, but I guess it was a little bit better before that, when the effects of the revolution were still in place, for example, or when the effects of the revolution still had more significance than that, and when the German communists were more likely to basically be willing to do more for the Soviets than they did before in order to achieve the success of the revolution. Even in 1920 was when there was not really any realistic chance anymore, because they just avoided to work with any kind of movement that would have supported them, because they called it bourgeois. So yeah, I think it was a little bit better before, in my opinion.
Yeah, it seems like kind of the vibe I'm getting from a lot of this is like that warning that Luxembourg had made shortly before her death about kind of the dangers of falling into the condition of a sect really just kind of become more and more pronounced as even as the party grows. Like, they're still kind of adopting these very sect-like behaviors and really kind of behaving in a way that's totally out of step with the political moment, which, again, is like, I think also speaks to where the party had been in the last 2 years, which included having some of their top leadership in January of 1919, Luxembourg, Liebknecht, and a few others either killed or arrested. And I think that, having such major respected leaders kind of taken out of the game really really screws things up. I mean, it's not like that it just all went to shit overnight, but it certainly doesn't help anything. I think it was majorly demoralizing, and I think that what we're seeing here is that there's a real kind of for a variety of reasons, but in my opinion, those among them is that there's a real lack of kind of clarity of where to go with, and like on the other hand, like it's also strikes me as quite understandable because the situation was not easy to parse, even if you're a very clever person. You know, it seems like the situation was up in the air in a lot of ways, and I think that's kind of another thing that we've been seeing throughout this stream, discussing the chapters that we've been discussing, is that, you know, there were so many, well, things could have gone this way, but they ended up going the other way, and not necessarily because like somebody had like a bad take and they followed the line and it went badly, but sometimes just because they weren't lucky, sometimes because somebody, you know, made a foolish choice, and or, you know, whatever. But I think what we're seeing is that kind of after the 1919 period, that there's kind of a continuing, like an ongoing, like lack of coherence in what the party is doing and kind of the direction it's going in. That's all I have to say about that.
Yeah, and by the way, this is something, I mean, of course, this is going a little bit further than we actually talk about, and then we actually will talk about. But especially going into the 1930s and going on with the 1920s and going into the 1930s, that proved to be even more true. So when, for example, the KPD leadership decided on Thälmann and pretty much rounded up around Thälmann, who pushed the party even more into a pro-Soviet Union direction, and into, of course, also a very Stalinist direction. And I think that, yeah, Luxemburg and I guess Liebknecht as well had a good idea of where this was going to end, or where this could end if the relations to the Soviet Union were becoming too big. I think that did make an impact, and that had a big impact, which is why I consider it to be a good choice that initially many communists or many revolutionaries wanted more of an independent German communism, or a own German communism and their own German socialism to go with in the revolution. And I think the influence of the Soviet Union did nothing good to the KPD in the end. Like I said, as it went out with people like Thälmann, yeah, that kind of proved that to be true later on.
Yeah, I guess I would say, as far as like the effect on relations between the KPD and the Bolsheviks, I guess it sort of depends on what sort of faction of the party perspective of the parties you're like looking at it from. Because obviously, if you're Levi, it's breaking from the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. If you're what is it, like Thalheimer and the people who were elevated in this particular, or the people in the new who were newly elevated to the Centrale, you know, from their perspective, it was an improvement of relations, or from like a Thalmann's perspective, later, as you brought up, right, a much sort of closer relationship. But I think sort of beyond, sort of like I was saying earlier, the sort of the sort of higher level of like relationships between the VKPD and the Comintern is sort of the divisions within the German working class itself at the time, and how you see this sort of splitting away of sort of like this very like hardcore of like leftist militants who want like revolution now, and it leads to this sort of like putschist actions, as they called it, like the March Action, and just the sort of vivid description discussions in the chapter about, attacking workers as like sort of declaring a revolt unilaterally and like attacking other workers as, scabs for not participating and like being unable to actually engage like the masses of the working class in their revolutionary upsurges, the way the even like the Spartacists, I would say, were more successful in doing, even though obviously they didn't ultimately succeed either. And so you have this split, like not with just within the party leadership, but within sort of the German working class itself, right? So you have that sort of group that like sort of ended up coalescing around like Fischer and Maslow. You have sort of the central, more centrist members, I guess you could say, and then you have like a great deal of the working class still putting its faith in the SPD and seeing that as sort of, the party of the German working class. And like ideally, like the role of the Communist Party would be able to actually like sort of unify and, connect the vanguard of the working class with like the working class as a whole. But instead we see sort of this spinning off in a bunch of different directions of various sort of sectors of the working class. And the same thing in like Italy in sort of the wake of the defeat of their revolutionary movements. So I think that's the sort of background to these, very like acrimonious debates.
Yep. I guess also that a very big mistake of the KPD in the first place, or the communist movement in the first place in Germany, was to alienate many big parts of the socialist movement after the revolution had turned out to be a failure, after the Spartacists had not reached their goal. Because I think that they could have very well appeared to people that supported the SPD, but still wanted to have a more radical change that the SPD suggested and that the SPD brought forth. So I think in the end, there probably could have been even another split within the SPD where some people could have been more radicalized than they already were, and could have still gotten on board with the idea of a more socialist Germany and a more socialist country, and less influenced by the capitalists. Because over the next course of the years, I guess they really did realize what the internal failure of the system was, and that they had to fight it no matter what. And that, of course, turned out to be the truth in the case of fighting the fascists, especially with the Iron Front coming together, and those socialists from the SPD and with other socialists together, de facto radicalizing and de facto making it clear that many people had a more radicalized idea of not just opposing fascists, but also opposing reactionaries in general, opposing capitalism in general, and to taking various kinds of means. But at that point, of course, the KPD was long gone to a side where they wouldn't side with anyone else, but what they deemed radical enough to engage with. And I think that the change should have been made in the 1920s, from more from a perspective of a German kind of communism or German kind of socialism that was there and that was a possibility for people to reach, other than to just going with the Leninist doctrine or the Leninist ideas of the idea of the Second International. Because of course, that was generally a good idea and generally not that bad of a thing, but I guess that they relied too heavy on people just lifting themselves up and like if we just wait, and if the situation gets worse, then the workers will rise up and everything will be fine. But that didn't happen. So why not just go ahead and try to influence the possible allies that you have?
It seemed like what struck me is that it seemed like the that the executive committee of the Comintern seemed to have kind of like a triumphalist attitude, like, yeah, we won in the October Revolution, and now revolution's going to be all over Europe. Yeah, let's do it. Let's go. But at the same time, I think they were like also, you know, just absolutely kind of needed to be thinking that way in some, because of the absolute destitution that the conditions of the Russian Civil War had left them in, because that lasts from 1918 to, I think, Simba, you're green again. Um, the Russian Civil War, which ends in 1920, is a victory for the Reds, but it's not an easily won victory, and it came at great cost, and absolutely you know left the Soviets in a very precarious situation. So I think that,
Yeah.
being that the executive had this kind of both like, come on, revolution now, let's do this, guys, like, had that attitude, I think is like, it's understand. I guess it's to me, at least, if that this is my reading of it, I think it's kind of unfortunate but understandable. Elizabeth, do you have any thoughts on that? Because I think you probably know a bit more about the Civil War than I do.
I mean, the Civil War was pretty desperate for sure, in particular, right? The Brest-Litovsk Treaty, where they were basically forced to cede a bunch of territory to Germany, obviously is tied up with the failure of the German Revolution and Russia's sort of encirclement. But I think, like, going back to what I was saying earlier, I think it's not just a matter of what, like, Moscow wanted, and also we can see from the book, like, different Russian communists had, like, sort of different views on what was going on, even though they weren't always necessarily, like, upfront about what those divisions were, in front of foreign communists. But I think it's not only that, but sort of the, like I was saying, the impatience of sort of a very particular, like, layer of the working class itself that were the ones sort of supporting and carrying out policies like the March Action. And I think looking at the experience of, like, the Spartacists and the sort of failed revolution in 1919, you have to look at, right, there is, like, the USPD that's attempting to sort of chart a middle course between the SPD's reformism and the Spartacists, and sort of a lot of what would become the Communist Party. And so I think you have to look at, like, why, if there is this sort of path available outside of the Comintern, like, why the United SPD, like, failed to actually really cohere or be able to, like, formulate a policy that was able to actually, like, lead to sort of lasting revolutionary change in Germany, and just sort of led to this uncertainty of, like, being for the workers' councils and being, for the Weimar government at the same time. And, like, why, Zinoviev and the Comintern was successful in splitting some of those people off and convincing them that, like, that they would be better off joining the Communist International. And also that, like, there was a lot of, like, organic sympathy with the working class towards, like, siding with the Soviet Union, regardless of whether a lot of it was romanticized at the time or not. And maybe, I think, even more so going into World War II, less because of, revolutionary potential, and more, a lot of it just, for the desire for like a military ally against fascism, basically. But I mean, like that's all just to say that, like, I don't think it's necessarily just a question of like sort of Moscow forcing its policies onto the German parties in and of itself, and also that, like, yeah, I'm not sure if there's like a sort of specifically German, authentic, organic, like, path that they could have taken. And also, sorry, my last thing is like, so you do see sort of the shift to the United Front tactic, in a large parts because of the fact that the March action was such a disaster, and sort of the idea of, extending a hand to the SPD and trying to engage SPD workers in sort of like joint programs that, or like joint struggles that both parties and like most working class people would agree on was good, and sort of trying to win over workers that way. So there is sort of a self-corrective at this point, which was semi-successful, although obviously not finally successful in forming a united front that could actually like combat fascism. And then, I mean, I think the last thing is just like the SPD itself bears responsibility for refusing to sort of deal with the KPD or unite with them in any real way, in that, it takes two to tango, basically, as far as, the inability. Well, one, right, the fact that like the SPD itself formed a barrier for the kind of revolutionary change that the KPD was seeking, and then like two, later, in terms of like being able to form any sort of like successful united front to prevent Hitler from coming to power.
That was great. Thank you, Elizabeth. That was a tremendous contribution there. Simba, are you still with us?
Yeah, no, I am.
Yeah.
I was just listening, but yeah, that was spot on. I mean, I don't have anything to add to that, but good information.
Yeah, so
pretty much, yeah. I would add that is, yeah, it was probably a really, really dumb idea of the Second International in the first place, or of the Soviets in the first place, to think that they had all the resources necessary as of 1920, for example, or the 1920s, the early 1920s, to do all that they wanted to do, to start the revolutions that they wanted to start the uprisings and the invasions that they wanted to start. I don't think that was ever really possible, and I think that they really, really did not see that, or did not acknowledge that.
There was a whole lot of, I guess, revolutionary optimism, maybe, more than is advised, probably. I mean,
yeah,
you could call it that, yeah.
Like unwarranted optimism, but at the same time, like, I mean, like I commented on previously, like, it not maybe unwarranted by the objective conditions, but like considering kind of the recent past, kind of an understandable kind of like momentum, I guess, like a feeling of momentum, right? Like,
yeah, I mean, they went
we
from
can win, let's do it.
Right.
Are you saying Super Tuesday was our generation's March action?
Oh God.
Stop.
Yeah, so, but I guess like maybe this is a good point in the discussion to kind of steer things to, how can we bring this conversation into, the modern day? Like, what do these events and what are kind of the things that the German communists experienced in these chapters? What relevance do they have for us thinking about the left's problems today? I mean, obviously, we're not in a kind of a similar state of having communist and socialist parties with hundreds of thousands or millions of members, but we're certainly experiencing very deep crises of capitalism and imperialism and so on. So, what do you folks think about the direction? Any lessons that you think we can take from these chapters?
Don't do false flags. I think not. One sort of like you have to actually hashtag do the work to like build any action you want, as opposed to like declaring the most radical action and then like attacking other working class people for like not being on your side and like branding them as like scabs or traitors, as opposed to like actually winning over the people that you have similar interests with. And I think also the importance of having like a world perspective and like a broader perspective of not just like narrowly like, what do I need to do, or like, what's the immediate next step, or like what is like the correct tactic, but like what sort of like situation are we in, as far as the strength of whatever the bourgeois class, the working classes, are we in period of upsurge, or are we period of downsurge, blah, blah, blah. And I feel like that's something that's really missing on the left today, that sort of like world perspective you get from like these common turn debates. Because like all sides, like regardless of whether they agree or disagree with each other, like have a sort of grounded theory of like where the world is at and sort of where the class struggle is going at.
Yeah, and I mean, I think there's like that kind of notion that we can just kind of like conjure an insurrection out of the ground. Like, I don't know if today anybody's really advocating that sort of thing. You hear people sloganeering about erecting guillotines in Central Park, which, don't get me wrong, I'm all for, but like,
we got the guillotine, you better run.
Yeah, but like, I'd say especially in the United States, kind of the dominant reaction, I guess, or the dominant faction from that on the left here is very much like a kind of a social democratic or whatever left liberal reformist kind of, well, Bernie Sanders got screwed out of the election again, so you know what will probably work next time? The same thing. We could talk about that.
It's so sad, but it's probably going to be true.
Yeah, I mean, no, I'm just waiting for Jacobin to endorse Joe Biden. That's me. That's me being salty.
I mean, they already endorsed transphobia, so why not go a step further?
Oh, I missed that. I missed that chapter.
Yeah.
I never. It is. I sometimes feel like I'm taking cheap shots when I shit on Jacobin, but then I go, nah, I'm fine.
What's this about Jacobin being transphobic?
Yeah, no, I missed that.
Yeah, they did post some articles. They were pretty turfy and centered around the theme of trans women being misogynist and something like that. I have to look it up still, but I think I can get it to you later if you want to.
So somebody, Atomic Source in the chat says, simply calling for a general strike in the U.S. is probably super unrealistic. I mean, yeah, like, you can't... A general strike, I think especially a lot of Americans have never seen or experienced a general strike in our lifetimes, because of just the incredible, like, deep state of reaction that's been, upon the U.S. for the last basically 40 years. We've had a couple of major, like, flashpoints of like protests, like Black Lives Matter and Occupy Wall Street and the anti-globalization movement in the 90s, but like we haven't, like, generationally we're starved of like major, like, mass working class actions and strikes, and we've seen kind of a bubbling of slightly larger strike movements over the last couple of years, like the teachers strike wave back in 2018. But I think the idea of a general strike, I think I'm all for it. Let's build towards a general strike, but like you can't just conjure it out of the ground.
I mean, didn't the U.S. actually have a recent general strike in terms of the general strike that pretty much ended the government shutdown, or that did end the government shutdown by Trump?
I think so. That was pretty specific to federal workers. And I'm frankly, I don't know enough about that. Elizabeth or Simba, are you familiar with enough, or because I know what you're talking about. I'm not fluent with the events that I can talk about at length.
Yeah, I'm not too familiar with it, but I was under the impression that was mostly federal workers and air traffic controllers.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was, but it was a general strike of the entire industry that was directed to end the government shutdown, right?
Yeah, and that was successful. However, like, as you can hear from simply just talking to us, that's very few people even remember or know about that. Like,
yeah,
it was so thoroughly kind of brushed under the table by our media. Like, and I will admit, the only reason I even remembered it now is because you prompted it in my head. Like, I remember reading about it and, like, cheering it on as it was happening, because I follow strikes and stuff, but like it has just kind of evaporated from memory. And I think
sorry,
please continue.
Well, I just had a debate with a liberal who advocated for voting for Biden and all of that. So I said that like he asked, like, how would you change anything through direct action and so on. So I was like, yeah, there was literally a general strike ended the government shutdown in the USA by Trump, not Nancy Pelosi, not people going to the voting booth. A general strike ended it, and a general strike was responsible for that. And I think that people, like I said that over the last few days very often, and we talked about this. That nothing brings class consciousness more than workers being out of work and losing their job and their income, but still being expected to pay the rent and their debt. And I think that this is a time where people will be able to see their potential and more of their potential. And I think that it is upon us, of course, as well, to give people the options or show people the options that they have to that they can take, other than just going to elect a certain president, because there are other options and people can take that. And I think that while there might not be an insurrection from one day to another or something, I think the chances of something like that happening the chances of more and more people wanting really radical change, that might happen. And I think that this is exactly why we as anarchists and communists, as you know, we want to call it that, radical leftists, need to target the movement that is, for example, behind Bernie Sanders, and not, as many other leftists do right now, alienating them because they go Bernie or bust. Well, they are disillusioned with the system.
We have to be the bust.
Exactly. We have to be the bust. We have to offer them an alternative to the system that they're disillusioned with. If not, then all of that power that is behind that movement that Bernie Sanders helped build completely evaporates, and that shouldn't be the case. That should at least be formed into a giant ass union, or just into a socialist party.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I'm in the DSA, and I've been involved in some conversations recently about how the level of discontent and like anger with the DNC over the Bernie shit, not just once but twice now, it's starting to kind of precipitate discussions of, well, what if we became a party? And I think that, or at the very least, a truly independent organization, capable of kind of doing things outside of the electoral system on a more systematic basis. And I think kind of there's a tangle of problems that have come from kind of both the kind of historical origins of the DSA being like a very explicitly anti-communist and reformist organization, but at the same time, like, there's this tension because now there's, tens of thousands of people involved who are like not have no connection to real the so-called official politics of the DSA, and are just kind of like, well, here's the biggest socialist organization in the country right now. I want to be a socialist. Let's learn about socialism. I mean, like, that's kind of what I've seen my place within the context here of like, well, I'm a revolutionary. How do I talk to as many newly radicalizing people as possible and, connect to them to the real ideas of socialism? Well, that's how I think, best use I can make of my time, for the time being at least. That's all I had to say for now.
Agreed. I think that the difficulty that I see with the idea of a general strike in the United States is not necessarily that there can't be strikes in particular, specific areas. I guess, like, federal workers are unionized because the federal government tolerates unionization among them, and air traffic controllers are people who literally can just like not be doing their job. Like, if they're not doing their job, people don't fly, and that's like disastrous for the economy. But there isn't so much of a union culture or ability to join a union that means much of anything among service workers, which is a whole bunch of people who are not homeowners, which tend to be the furthest left demographic of people who do not own homes. So I guess, yeah. I mean, a socialist party would be a good prospect for that. Like, do you think that, like, say a Bernie Sanders would have a better chance of doing much of anything if he ran with like PSL? Like, is anybody here voting for Gloria La Riva or voting in the upcoming election at all?
I'm not voting.
Neither am I.
Definitely not voting.
But you're in Germany, you cheater.
Oh, wait.
Trolling the whole trolling the whole stream. Kiara's in Germany, just so everyone knows.
Gotcha.
So
You're about 11 days late for April Fools, just by the way.
Damn it.
Elizabeth, did you want to chime in on this?
I mean, like, I feel like it's hard in these particular chapters to draw any sort of like direct one-to-one comparison, if only because they're in this situation of like a revolutionary upsurge where like ultra leftism is an actually like substantial and somewhat powerful force within the working class. Which is how like you can have things like the March Action, as opposed to like now when, like you were saying, Melody, there is this sort of like prevailing social democratic like common sense, I guess you could say, through a lot of the left. Although I think a lot of that is fracturing upon like Sanders failing to win the nomination, and I don't claim any sort of like foreknowledge about where sort of the socialist movement is going to go from there. But yeah, that's what I have to say.
Yeah, I mean, it's, like, I think dealing with the fallout of, I think it was somewhat obvious in 2016 how absolutely, rigged the Democratic primary was against Sanders. But I think it's like this time, like all the stops got pulled out, and the collusion was so like cartoonish that like I think that there's going to be a lot of people, like newly radicalizing people, who are looking for answers, and like not just like ideological answers, but like material answers. Like, how do I join an organization that's actually going to fight for my interests as a trans person, as a non-white person, as a working class person, etc. Like, those are big, and like a lot of people have come to those conclusions already, sure, but like I think that there's, anytime that there's such a blatant rupture like that, like such a big public display of, ruling class fuckery, that that sort of thing, that there's going to be, I think, a pretty significant layer of newly radicalizing people, and that's encouraging, but it's like also, like Elizabeth said, like there's probably points here where like the analogies, trying to draw too many analogies is probably a bit of a stretch. And
I mean,
yeah, sorry, go ahead.
It is a big thing to compare those scenarios exactly, because that will of course never be the case. Like, we definitely don't have the situation in the US as we did in Germany with the radicalization to the left, but that can still become a thing. And I think that in the next few months and years that will become a thing, because more people will be radicalized just alone by the surroundings that are, or by the things that are going on, by the environment they will be in. At the end of the corona pandemic, which will probably go on for about 2 more years, because as of right now, a lot of things point to that being a pandemic that will pretty much come every year, or come back every year. By that point, it's going to be extremely the financial crisis that was coming anyway, the recession that was coming anyway, will be extremely accelerated, if you want to use that term. And it will be so much worse than it already is, because right now we are facing the worst crisis, I think, not just only since the Great Depression, but even worse than the Great Depression.
Yeah.
And I think that the fact that there is not somebody, and there's not going to be somebody like FDR who can make a new deal and who can create a new deal to soften the blow, that will mean that a lot more people will suffer and a lot more people will radicalize. A lot more people will be disillusioned with the system and search for different actions. Now, we could be facing just a similar situation as in the 1930s, where the answer to many people is just fascism. But we can also face a similar point where the disillusionment of the people, the suffering of the people goes on to a point where people decide to lean towards another direction. And that is the very big difference between the 1930s and, for example, the end of the First World War. Because even if the financial crisis is, of course, not a world war, it still puts the US in a extremely similar situation of, being depleted of resources, losing the fight against Corona, losing the fight against the financial crisis, and many people having to suffer. So it does make sense that many people will take that chance to take another solution, to take another step. And this is also why I said that one of the most important things we can do right now is go towards those people who are essential to something like that. Go towards, for example, soldiers. One of the main aspects of the revolution in Germany being a thing in the first place were that the soldiers decided to rise up, that the soldiers decided to not take that anymore. And the second most important thing, as Kropotkin writes about, of course, is to secure the Pret, conquer the Pret. So I guess that some of the two most important classes, or two most important branches of the working class, are farmers and soldiers, because you're going to need them.
And I think what you pointed to just a moment ago was that, there doesn't seem to be kind of a new FDR. Like, I think that's, I mean, not that we would want that, just to be clear, but that I think kind of, especially like what the ruling circles in the United States have really shown over the last 20 years is that even forget about leftist or socialist anything for a minute. They have shown that they do not want to tolerate one iota of the most tepid reform, of the most, slightest concession to the working class. Everything has been about, negotiating things on the margins of the capital's power, right? So, like, I think the example that I always bring up is how, Obama, despite being, like we as leftists now, of course, look on Obama as, a neoliberal farce, but at the same, like, the fact that in the ruling circles he was derided as a socialist for wanting to pass these I honestly don't think that was simply like a propagandistic, I think it's partially a propagandistic line, but at the same time, I genuinely think that on some level we must stop socialism, Obama's a socialist thing, was in part kind of fueled by that whole, faction of the Democratic Party being like, well, maybe we should reform our incredibly backwards draconian healthcare system just a little bit, even if it totally rigs things in favors of the insurance companies. I think we should maybe do just, please, just a tiny little bit. No. I think that was kind of illustrates kind of the broader point that I make about the direction that kind of that the American ruling class has really taken over the last 20 years, which is not giving a fucking inch. And that can only hold for so long, especially because of the pace of economic and social change that's been happening underneath. And I'm working on an essay right now, which is all about the concept of a palace revolution, which is, I think, really what liberals are looking for in the body of living corpse Joe Biden. Actual living corpse, definitely still alive Joe Biden. I think that's what they're looking for. Is a new a more competent master, although you wouldn't know it by looking at Joe Biden. Right, like, it seems like, what they really wanted was another Obama, right? Somebody who can, put on a smiley face and keep the empire happily drone striking the shit out of the world, and continuing to make big concessions to big business at the federal level. But I think that you know that doesn't sell anymore, and I think that's what this election cycle has kind of shown, is that, like, the only support that the liberals have really been able to drum up has been from these kind of, petty bourgeois constituencies that really just kind of want to go back to brunch and forget all about this terrible notion of an empire in decline, because that's just not how they conceptualize the political, the geopolitical situation.
Yeah, absolutely.
Simba or Elizabeth, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
I guess it's kind of irrelevant at this point, but we should at least I would like to mention that we should at least be careful to try not to blame the voters so much about Bernie's campaign, because, like, his campaign was not perfect and he lost twice, didn't get 20% of the black vote in any southern state both times, and like, he ran as a Democrat both times as well.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, I don't think that anybody here was, like, going on any wild conspiracy theories or anything, but, like, the Democratic Party, if you run as a left-wing Democrat, is just going to, like, do that.
Yeah.
And so we need, like, a better method to, like, subvert them doing the thing,
Yeah. And I guess what I was more getting at, just so my point isn't kind of misconstrued, is that I really think, like, I'm very explicitly not blaming voters. I'm kind of, when I say liberals, I'm really pointing to kind of the DNC apparatchiks and think tank mega donors, and blah blah blah, the big people with real pull in the liberal political class, not like ordinary people who call themselves liberals, because that's a very broad stratum of people. But yeah, I think that it speaks to the intransigence of that class of people, the people who are actually pulling the strings in the party, and undermining democracy within the party, but the democracy such as it was, which was paper thin to begin with. But I digress.
Right.
I
Okay,
mean,
yeah.
I was. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Just I didn't mean to imply that you were doing that, Mel, but yeah, go ahead. See what you're gonna say.
Well, I was just in a debate with a liberal, and he literally told me that well, the U.S. is not really the U.S. is not really a country that is based on revolution. That's just like, wait, what? What? I mean, I guess I would say that there is more revolutionary potential in a lot of people in the US than many might think, and a lot less trust in the system than many might think.
Agreed. I also oh, go ahead, Elizabeth.
Oh no, I was just saying I agree.
Yeah. I do also think that it would take the kind of global perspective that you mentioned earlier, though. I think that Americans think of themselves as very cut off from the rest of the world, and that's sort of a problem.
Yeah. Well, and I think, there's layers to that, right? Because there's a lot of indoctrination that goes on with that, right? We're all brought up with that good old American exceptionalism. America's the greatest country on earth, blah blah blah. Everywhere else is a backwards shithole, and we're welcomed as liberators whenever we go invade some third world country. Of course. And those who resist are just resisting because they hate freedom or some vague platitude like that. But
I literally just had a liberal justify the Iraq War, and I mean Iraq War 2003.
oh my god,
because we had to bring freedom and democracy. We had to liberate the people, like literally saying that.
I think that's like really sick because like on a couple levels, like so for one thing, just like briefly, like the real committed liberals back then were for one thing like fully on board with the war.
Yeah.
But like at the same time, like nobody, like those are some of the biggest anti-war protests in U.S. history. Some of the biggest protests in U.S. history, period, were the anti-Iraq war protests. So like, it's kind of like a sickening, like revision of history to look back on that and be like, oh yeah, people actually believed in that. Nobody fucking believed in that. Everybody called bullshit, and everybody detested the Bush administration for doing it. And I mean, like the public mood was definitely a lot different than it is now, right? But like, yeah, it's kind of always makes me just shake my head in disbelief a little bit when we hear, current liberals kind of defending something like that was even then totally indefensible, and that most afterwards would have admitted, like, yeah, that was a mistake.
Yeah, absolutely, and not just that. It also goes to show that, the opinion of the people as a majority is often completely misinterpreted by those people in power, and very often deliberately so. To paint a different image of, oh, the people wanted that, oh, the people stand for that because they voted for the liberals or they voted for the Republicans. No, fuck no, that doesn't matter at all. Like in Germany, we had a conservative government for years now, mainly. Oftentimes coalition with the SPD because the Social Democrats don't give a shit at all anymore. But the fact is that in 2017, basically the conservatives under Angela Merkel pushed for an election on equal marriage rights, because the SPD already pushed for it before that, and the CDU, the conservatives, wanted to take that point away from them. However, at this point, there has been consistently for years a general opinion in the public for over more than 70% of people voting clearly in favor of equal marriage rights. So if it were up to the people, this would be a completely different picture, and this would be a completely different thing. but it was never really up to the people. It was just up to a minority of the people in the entire country. Hell, it was even up to a minority of the voters who pretty much voted for the government in place. And I think that we have to keep that in mind, that in a representative democracy, especially in the US, it's only a minority of people in the entire country who decides who will be in the government and who will not be in the government.
Yeah.
And we should lay our focus on that, and we should call that out, because that means that there is a big majority who does not want that government, who wants something else, who wants something different than that.
Right. And I mean, like, the politically enfranchised class in the United States has always been disproportionately white and wealthy, and that hasn't changed. It's still true. Yeah, I kind of so we've been talking for including our opening summaries for about 2 hours now. So I just kind of wanted to make sure I'm being respectful of everyone's time here. I would like to kind of start wrapping things up. So if folks kind of want to give their closing thoughts either on kind of the discussion that we've been having or further reflections on the reading, I would like to give everyone just kind of a one last go around in whatever order you think is appropriate. So, yeah.
Who's first?
You can go if you want.
Okay. Well, as I said before at the start, when I chimed in, was that I guess there are very important lessons to be learned from the German Revolution, or especially from the Weimar Republic, and that many things echo throughout history, and many things are coming back to haunt us, and that the especially the uprise of fascists in Germany is something that we can learn from very well, and that we can learn from in terms of taking measures that we back then did not take. Taking clear measures that, for example, we need to deplatform fascists wherever they are, wherever they appear. And we need to radicalize the workers to a point, or we need to converse with the workers and get to them on a level that we will accept that they have problems with the system, and they are disillusioned with the system, instead of advocating for voting for neoliberals and calling them bad and terrible people because they don't want to do harm reduction. That's not going to do anything. And I think that this is also a lesson that goes along with the KPD. The more radical leftists very often failed to radicalize and ally with the allies that they had available to them, with the people that could be convinced that there is another solution and there's a better way and there's a possibly better system awaiting for them. And I think the KPD failed to do that because, frankly, at some point they decided that everything that wasn't strictly and utterly communist in their kind of way, in their kind of view, that it was completely bourgeois and counter-revolutionary and something like that. And yeah, there always is a line where that might be the case, but I think we need to appeal to a wider range of people, wider variety of working class people that can be radicalized and can be convinced that there is another way, that there is another solution, that there is other hope than just voting to a voting ballot. And I guess a good start in that would be to invest in any kind of movement that can achieve that, in any kind of movement that can build that.
All right. Thank you. Simba or Elizabeth, either one of you can go next if you'd like.
I guess I could go.
All right.
Sure. So, um, I guess there are a couple of things that you can sort of make analogies uh, to here and now from the German Revolution. For example, the economic forwardness and the political backwardness, and then things that you can't, like the prevalence of ultra leftism. Um, but as a whole, I think that um, the failure to mobilize like a whole bunch of people and have leadership that was consistent about things is like what I would take away from this past couple of chapters. Like here, I guess we're coming to a turning point where a whole lot of people who are very far left um, don't like the Democratic Party, like as a whole, not just this or that candidate, but as a whole. And so whatever comes after the Democratic Party or whatever um, the Democratic Party becomes, hopefully it just, gets thrown in the wastebasket of history. But whatever is after that, it has to be consistent and it has to appeal to people on a local level rather than um, the sort of like nationalistic, patriotic uh, Democratic Party sort of mantra and slogan. So if ultra leftism ever does become a problem, I guess we can fight that then. But as of now, consistent leadership that actually does shit that people care about is what we need to look for, and what Germans didn't have back in the day.
All right. Thank you. Elizabeth, did you have anything you wanted to share before we close things out here?
Yeah, I mean, I guess just sort of it's easier to sort of look back, having the hindsight of history, having access to all these sorts of documents at once and like having sort of the time to sift through them to sort of come to conclusions. But like when you're sort of reading it and in it, you can sort of sense how, like in the moment, it's much more difficult to sort of make these assessments. And I guess just it's a good sort of lesson to caution against sort of smugness and to just remember that like when you're sort of making these decisions on the ground in like a real situation, it's a lot easier to make mistakes than we might like to think, I guess. So that's not terribly uplifting, but I know in a way I think it is, because it like sort of takes the pressure off to be like that there's you just have the perfect line all the time and that's how you win, which is like not true.
No. Yeah, and we've talked about that on this stream before. Like, we have to be very kind of careful of this reading of history of, oh, well, if they had just done X, Y, or Z, they could have won, or they could, right? Like, because we have the privilege of having access to all this information. And like, I think like an ongoing kind of thing that we've discovered through doing this reading is that there was like a real paucity of information for a lot of these people. Like the access of information of international affairs was highly distorted because of things like censorship, especially with like the regard to like the Italian situation and the Russian Revolution, because one of the biggest problems with that the Italians had is that they didn't have, because of censorship, because of very poor information, their kind of orientation towards the Soviets was very ended up being very confused, and I think we can surmise that there was, similarly distorted kind of information and ideas about what the Russian Revolution did or didn't mean in Germany. And yeah, it's we have to be very careful and very kind of humble in saying, well, you know, we weren't there, and it's easy for us to maybe judge a little harshly about, well, they did this when they really should have done that. Well, how would we know? That's kind of we've repeated something to that effect on previous streams here. Um, And so I guess I will give my closing thoughts here, which is kind of tailing off of what Simba said about leadership. And like I think one of the things that's really clear from reading this section is that leadership has to be like working class leadership has to be like very concrete and based on real connection to the masses, and not you can't just conjure leadership out of thin air. You have to be doing the legwork, for lack of better words, for many years to gain the confidence of working class people. No matter what tendency you represent, whether you're an anarchist or an ML or some other revolutionary stripe, like if you don't do that work, that is one of the biggest, like I think, potential pitfalls of running into a revolutionary situation, thinking that you're so prepared and you're gonna knock them dead, and then shit completely hits the fan. So that's work that I say that in our situation in the U.S. especially, like that's the work we should be doing now. Is this slow, careful, tedious work of creating that of forming that layer of leadership, which I think, just briefly, that is in some ways really counter to a lot of what I like, the mood I see in a lot of circles, which is that like, oh, we have to be doing we have to be doing something right now for something that's going to happen, shit hitting the fan tomorrow, which is just like, I think a real, like I understand there's a real urgency, but at the same time, I don't think it's leads to a good assessment of what's actually feasible. And I think that without getting into a whole mess of my uncollected thoughts there, I think I'll just leave it at that. So I want to once more give my co-hosts a chance to, say where folks can find you online before we close out for the day. Once again, I'm Melody, and this is my channel, World to Win. Please subscribe and hit the bell so you get notifications. We do this study group every 2 weeks. My regular co-hosts, laborkyle and Izzy Does Everything, will be hopefully back with us 2 weeks out from now. At the same time, 3:30 Pacific, 6:30 Eastern. So co-hosts, please let's remind our audience where they can find you.
I am Simba on Twitter, Young Simba on pretty much everything else. I'm going to do American history and Black and Indigenous history mostly. And yeah, that's pretty much me.
Well, I'm Kiara Husk, and I am a leftist Twitch streamer. So you'll find me on Twitch TV/Kiara Husk, and on Twitter at Scumbag Leftist. I talk a lot about history. I talk a lot about philosophy, economics, and of course anarchism, because after all, I'm still a crusty anarchist, and also the world's most middle-aged interior policy advisor. And also, I would really like to add, wer hat uns verraten? Sozialdemokraten.
You want to give the non-German speakers around here a chance at that?
That was a very common saying that belonged to a bit of a further text to that. In Germany during the revolution, and then afterwards when the KPD came up. And it means afraid of Democrats. and it goes on to who will free us, the Communist Party. Okay.
All right.
And my name is Elizabeth. I have a sporadically updated blog at unevenlydevelopedposts.org, where hopefully I will be posting more soon due to quarantine-induced free time. But yeah.
Yeah, and thank you once again to our audience for joining us. Once again, you can hop over to, if you want to directly support the show with your dollars, you can hop over to my Patreon at patreon.com/aworldtowin, and follow me on Twitter at aworldtowin1. Please like this video. Once it's published, please leave a comment if just to help boost the algorithm, and subscribe to the channel and share this stream on your social media, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, whatever it is you use. Share it on your Discord servers. If you would like to get a copy of this book, I have a PDF, and please feel free to send me a DM on Twitter if you'd like to get your hands on a copy of that book. So we're going to be picking up with chapters 27 through 30 2 weeks from now, which is April 26th. And we will be continuing on with that. And just for this week, I will be having another live discussion with Melanie of Milk Tea Leninism on Friday, the 17th at 1 p.m. Pacific time. We'll be talking about the state and revolution. So don't make sure not to miss that. And I will be having I'll be promoting that on my Twitter, so if you follow me on Twitter, you'll keep getting updates about that. So thanks everyone once again for joining us, and we'll hopefully see you around my channel in the next couple of weeks.